since time immemorial, since we can remember, since forever.
This is our ancestral territory.
It would be impossible to live in rural Alaska if we were not able to live off the land.
Alaska Natives were here long before Alaska became a state just half a century ago. Since then, the state's economy has thrived because of oil, but not everyone has benefited from that wealth. And the promise of oil profits has created a rift between those who live off the land and those who want to profit from its natural resources. This is the story of that divide.
There's over 227 tribes in the state of Alaska. Every territory in the state has an indigenous nation that has inhabited that area since time immemorial.
It was a very challenging way of life. We're living in 60 below zero for weeks at a time. In the wintertime, no sunlight for large portions of the year. Our people were survivors.
The first outsiders to come to Alaska in modern history were Russian fur traders in the 18th century. And even though indigenous people had been living there for tens of thousands of years, the Russians stole the claim to the land, calling Alaska their own. And in 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million.
The whole problem from the earliest days on was the United States sort of bought a flawed title.
Toward the end of that century, more and more outsiders came to Alaska, either to make their fortunes or to spread their religion. But with the influx of outsiders came new diseases that Alaska Natives didn't have immunities to.
It was a really horrific time because we lost so many families, so many people so fast that there was no place to put the bodies. I mean, they just had to pile them up, mass graves.
From the time of contact up until about the early 1920s, it's said that we lost 2/3 of our population.
By the 1930s, Alaska Natives were experiencing another traumatic loss, as Native children were sent to schools based on Western education, including boarding schools.
When they were sent there, if they were wearing their traditional clothing, all their clothing was removed and put outside in a pile as they went into the school. The boys' hair were cut to be short. They weren't allowed to speak their language. In situations of my own mother being sent away for 7 years of her childhood and being told that she can't speak her language, that she's not a Gwich'in person, that she has to become something than who she is in order to succeed in the world today.
They would come home and they would be displaced because the parents didn't know who they were. The parents didn't speak the same language as their children. They didn't know how to hunt or be able to survive on the land, so there was this huge disconnection. Even though I didn't live through that time, I feel like I did. It just was passed down. You know, I don't understand why my grandmother doesn't speak Inupiaq to me, or, I don't understand that, but I feel it.
During World War II, thousands of soldiers were sent to be stationed in Alaska, and for the first time, Alaska Natives became a minority on their own land. And then in 1958, Alaska held a vote to become a state or remain a territory. The vote for statehood passed easily because Alaska Natives didn't have much of a say. But statehood did not clear things up for who really owned the land.
There were some Indian villages between Anchorage and Fairbanks that were complaining that the state was taking their land.
Willie Hensley was only 25, a grad student in 1966, when he stumbled upon something that changed his life and the lives of all Alaska Natives. Even though the young state was obligated to protect land where Alaska Natives lived, those boundaries had never been drawn, and so the young state had started to take the land for itself.
I realized that we're going to lose that land forever. We're never going to get it back. And so, as a student, I decided that we had to stop it.
Willie decided to run for state house to get the word out, and he helped rally Alaska Natives across the state to claim their land.
Senator Hensley of Kotzebue.
Our rallying cry was, take our land, take our life. And it was controversial because we weren't accustomed to taking on the government. We had been encouraged to obey authority. It took a little bit of nerve to actually not only say no, but hell no, you can't have it.
As Alaska Natives organized to claim their land, something happened that got the state and the world to really pay attention.
Oil at Alaska's North Slope at Prudhoe Bay, a lot of it. possibly the biggest discovery in history.
As soon as you had the discovery of yet another vast natural resource that could be exploited in Alaska, you had the interest of major international corporations.
The state was in desperate straits. I mean, they were financially going down the drain because the state couldn't afford statehood. You know, we had this teeny population, no revenue of any consequence, high costs, and they needed that money, you know, from oil.
The oil industry really just wanted it resolved. They just wanted to make sure they have access to the oil, and in particular that they had access to a corridor to build the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline.
In order to build that pipeline, the state needed to know who in fact owned title to the land it would cross. And so the land claims argument became front and center.
We literally had no time, we had no money. Initially we had no lawyers, we had no communication system, and we had to create structures. We didn't even have institutions.
We had some very young leaders who were in their early 20s, most of them, many not college educated.
For the next 3 years, these young leaders, including Willie, rushed back and forth to Washington, D.C., doorstepping congressmen to pay attention to their cause.
In 71, it came together. All of a sudden, the House passes a version of the bill, the Senate passes a version, and it was in conference.
On December 18, 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. Alaska Natives ended up getting 44 million acres of land, about 10% of Alaska, and $963 million to compensate for the land they lost. At the time, it was the largest Native land settlement, which for many felt like a huge success. But not everyone felt the settlement was fair.
The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was an illegitimate act that was forced on our people. Most Alaska Natives did not have a say. Just a handful had a say.
It was sort of bittersweet because it was more than any other Native American group ever received out of Congress. But still, you know, we knew that we were letting go of a huge amount of our traditional land holdings.
As part of the settlement, the land was not transferred directly to Alaska Natives. Instead, it created Alaska Native corporations, which would own those 44 million acres. Alaska Natives became shareholders in those corporations.
Hunters and fishermen and housewives that we were, you know, all of a sudden we had to sort of try to think like businessmen.
Just imagine coming from a little tiny community where your people don't even speak English and being told, you have a corporation now and you need to successfully manage this corporation or you can be overtaken.
Many of these Native corporations did see big profits because of oil and mining. They worked with companies like ExxonMobil, BP, and ConocoPhillips. But these are the same industries that have contributed to climate change, threatening the hunting and fishing grounds of Alaska Natives.
The thing about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is there was one line item that said all Alaska Natives gave up Aboriginal rights to the land. It was one tiny line.
This line meant that Alaska Natives could no longer hunt, fish, and gather where they had been doing so for tens of thousands of years. They were now subject to hunting licenses, restricted areas, and designated seasons.
They were coerced into signing. They were told, this is the best bill that you're going to get.
There simply was no other way to get control of our space.
Since the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay and the signing of ANCSA, oil has been the economic driver in Alaska. Oil tax revenue has paid for schools, streetlights, and social programs. The oil industry employs a third of the state's workers. It's allowed the state to do away with sales and income taxes. And it's created the Permanent Fund, which pays each resident an annual dividend of about $1,000.
The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that 800-mile steel pipe going through the middle of Alaska, has been the lifeline for Alaska. I mean, really, it's created modern Alaska.
But many Alaska Natives never saw all those profits. It's still extremely expensive to live in the villages, where many homes lack basic plumbing.
Most Alaska Native villages still hunt, we still fish, we still gather. We have to live that way. We have to have our way of life. Money is short term, but the land will always be here for us to provide for us, and we have to care for the land.